All right, we are in the book of 1 Kings, and we got a good way into chapter 8 last time. Chapter 8 is the longest chapter in the book, so we didn't finish. But we are in 1 Kings chapter 8, and we had finished up Solomon's lengthy prayer. And the main point of that prayer was basically a petition to God that even though God is so great and so vast that He does not actually fit into the temple, there is nonetheless a hope on the part of Israel that the Lord will hear the prayers that are made towards the temple and in the temple, and that the Lord will forgive the sins of the people who pray in such a manner. That's the basic point of the prayer. God is so great that the temple cannot contain Him, and that heaven itself cannot contain Him. And yet, the Lord is still asked and petitioned that He might hear the prayer of those who humble themselves and ask for forgiveness. We come now to verse 54 of chapter 8. It says that when Solomon had finished praying this entire prayer and supplication to the Lord, he arose from before the altar of the Lord, from kneeling on his knees with his hands spread toward heaven, and he stood and blessed all the assembly of Israel with a loud voice, saying, "Blessed be the Lord who has given rest to His people Israel, according to all that He has promised. Not one word has failed of all His good promise, which He promised through Moses His servant. May the Lord our God be with us as He was with our fathers. May He not leave us or forsake us, that He may incline our hearts to Himself, to walk in all His ways, and to keep His commandments and His statutes and His ordinances which He commanded our fathers. And may these words of mine, with which I have made supplication before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God day and night, that He might maintain the cause of His servant and the cause of His people Israel, as each day requires, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God. There is no one else. Let your heart, therefore, be wholly devoted to the Lord your God, to walk in His statutes and to keep His commandments as at this day." All right, so as soon as Solomon is done praying, the very next thing he does is, kind of another prayer, it looks like. A blessing on the people of Israel. So, it's kind of one of those questions, that comes up. Do we need to offer another prayer in this situation? Now, some might say, well, Solomon, we already prayed. This service has gone on long enough. It's almost time to leave and get to lunch. If we don't leave now, we'll have to wait. But that's not the way they view this at all. There is no such thing as too much prayer. There is no such thing as too much blessing, too much worship. That is a concept that is completely foreign to the biblical writers. And it is one that I think perhaps we ought to give more consideration towards as a society, as a culture, as a congregation. And it says here that Solomon blesses the people in verse 55. He stood and blessed all the assembly of Israel. What does that mean when it says he blessed the assembly?
God's vicar of Christ on the earth, and He had the authority.
All right, now how many people think Mark's answer is completely wrong? He just, this is typical. Mark, everything he just said was completely wrong. Sometimes people miss his sarcasm. But that's not why. What does it mean that he blessed the people?
He was asking God.
He was asking God for blessing. What does that mean, to bless something? To speak well of something, to be of benefit to them. Which, blessing is either giving someone benefit or calling down benefit on someone else. In some cases we speak of blessing God, like in the New Testament it talks about blessed be God. The word there is a word from which we get our English word eulogy, which means to speak well of something. And here, of course, we have blessing Solomon blesses the people, but really, throughout this whole speech, he's not speaking well of the people, he's speaking well of God. He's speaking good things about God. He blesses the people by blessing God. And God, what has God done for Israel? Everything. It says He gave rest to His people in verse 56. He has fulfilled His promise. Not one word has failed. It talks about, interestingly, the promise through Moses. We talk about the promise to Abraham and the promise to David. But, Moses, we don't typically think about Moses being associated with a promise. But the Bible indicates that that is the case here in this verse. There was a promise spoken through Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as He was with our fathers. May He not leave us or forsake us. That is the call for blessing on the people right there. That God will continue to do the good things for Israel that He has already been doing. We ought to pray the same way. We thank God for blessing us and continue to pray for His continued favor. More than that, verse 58, that He may incline our hearts to Himself. The goal is, God, help us put our hearts in the right place. Help our hearts be inclined to serve You. Help us want to serve You. That's the goal. It's not just, oh God, help me keep rules 1 through 10. It's help me want to keep the rules. Help my heart to be inclined towards You. That's the thing that we ought to pray, is that the Lord will actually put our hearts more and more in the right place in regards to serving Him. And, He calls in verse 59 for the words of Solomon to be near to the Lord day and night as each, for God to maintain the cause of His servant and the cause of His people Israel as each day requires. You think about that last expression, as each day requires. Solomon has said a lot in this chapter about the sweeping big picture of redemptive salvation. But Solomon doesn't neglect the day-to-day need. Is it appropriate to pray for God to help us just for this day and just for each day, subsequently one at a time? Well, we are supposed to. There's a sense in which we're supposed to take our service to the Lord one day at a time. The everyday, mundane, day and night behavior of our lives. You know what that says? That says more about your service to God than the occasional things, the eventful things. Who you are when there's nothing really going on. That says more about us than anything. The everyday, day-to-day life makes us a lot who we are in terms of our relationship with the Lord.
Bible story, for example, of Abraham, we only have life on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
But he lived years now. When God told him to take his son Isaac and offer him up as a burnt offering to God, that was just something. You think that was just something Abraham did on the spur of the moment? You're wrong. Abraham lived a day-to-day service to God that brought him to God said to do that.
That's who he was.
And it's that everyday plodding along that we don't read about.
Right. The righteous shall live by faith, not occasionally have faith. It's something, that says a lot about who we are as a Christian, is what we're doing, when nothing's going on. No, we ought to be, how we handle crisis and controversy is also indicative of who we are as well. But serving God isn't something, I served God a couple of weeks ago. Wasn't that wonderful? Well, you should be serving God every day. That's what you should be doing. It's the eventful. Prayer shouldn't be something that's a huge. This is the big once a month deal. No, we wouldn't do that with other things. We don't adopt the philosophy of taking a bath once a month, whether we need that or not, or eating once a month. Let's not do that with things like prayer or the Scripture either. So here, and then of course he addresses the nation itself in verse 61. Let your heart therefore be wholly devoted to the Lord our God, to walk in His statutes, to keep His commandments as it is this day. The other thing I thought this was interesting, and I don't want to labor too long on this point, but in verse verse 54, it indicates Solomon's posture when he was giving this prayer was that he was kneeling on his knees with his hands spread towards heaven. Now, I've never seen anybody pray like that. That's a kind of a, and maybe posture is a cultural thing, but it is interesting to me how, the universal prayer postures in the Bible are people who are either kneeling or who have their hands spread out towards heaven. We don't see so much of that today. Now, maybe even in the last, there are some people here who can remember the time when people used to kneel while praying. But that thing doesn't even take place very much anymore. You see that? Does it mean anything? No. Kathleen has something. Right. I mean, let's ask ourselves a question for a second. Does physical posture in and of itself mean anything in terms of our relationship with God? No. Okay. Okay. All right. But, so on the one hand, technically, the heart and the body are technically not, what one is doing in this way, one can be submitted to the Lord in their heart without necessarily physically prostrating oneself. We get that. But does physical posture affect the way we think? Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah. Yeah. I believe they do the same thing in India, too. They have a more prostration-based prayer over there. Yeah.
I was going to say that...
I was pointing to you because you had your hand raised, but he verified what I said, too, because he's been over there.
What I was going to say was that when I am dressing, I'm going to frame the mind to think about what I'm
All right.
preparing worship while I'm clothes that I wear, and I'm thinking about it. So it helps me in a worshipful frame of mind. Here.
Right.
So there are things that we can do that help our brain to get in a certain gear, you might say.
Right. There's no prescriptive form of posture for prayer. There's no place in the Bible where you can point to a book, chapter, and verse and say, and this is the way you must always, posture yourself whenever you're praying. It is interesting that the word for worship, that's translated worship in the New Testament several times, actually means prostration, but that's another issue in and of itself. But nonetheless, we don't have any indication that that's specifically commanded. And so we can't bind a church ordinance that says everybody must pray exactly this way. But we can maybe think about ourselves a little bit as individuals and just think, is there something I can do to, help me focus my mind a little bit better? Some physical action I can take that'll help, in my devotional life to the Lord. Something to consider. I said I wasn't going to belabor the point too long, so we're going to move on from there. But just leave that with you for consideration. Verse 62 through 66 kind of wrap up the chapter with a list of sacrifices that are offered here. It says, now the king and all Israel with him offered sacrifice before the Lord. Solomon offered for the sacrifice of peace offerings, which he had offered to the Lord, 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the sons of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord. On the same day, the king consecrated the middle of the court that was before the house of the Lord, because there he offered the burnt offering and the grain offering and the fat of the peace offering, for the bronze altar that was before the Lord was too small to hold the burnt offerings and the grain offering and the fat of the peace offerings. So Solomon observed the feast at that time, and all Israel with him, a great assembly from the entrance of Hamath to the brook of Egypt, before the Lord our God, for 7 days and 7 more days, even 14 days. And on the 8th day he sent the people away, and they blessed the king. They went to their tents, joyful and glad of heart, for all the goodness that the Lord had shown to David his servant, and to Israel his people. All right, now, All right, so they offer all these sacrifices, and they're huge. This is a way of dedicating the house of God. And one thing to point out, and this question is going to require us to kind of travel back to the Dark Ages when we were studying Leviticus. What was it that a peace offering was for? What was the special thing about a peace offering? What made it unique compared to other offerings? Jen? Okay, it was a more voluntary offering, that's true. And that was definitely something that set it apart. What was the other big thing that set it apart? No, peace offerings and guilt offerings are different. Guilt offerings were typically offered as a way of restituting for some kind of wrong. Guilt offerings usually involved a monetary payment. But peace offerings were more about expressing one's fellowship with God, expressing one's sharing. Yeah, Thanksgiving offerings were one type of peace offering. That's true. Jen? Okay. There was a communal meal that went with it. The peace offering was the only offering where the worshiper was permitted to eat of the sacrifice. The burnt offering, nobody could eat. The grain offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering, only the priests could eat it, and they could only do it if it was not offered on their own behalf. That's the key to that. If a priest offered a sacrifice on his own behalf, he couldn't eat a portion of it. But the peace offering got a portion for the priest and a portion for the worshiper who gave it, because it was a means of expressing one's fellowship with the Lord. So they offer all these peace offerings here at the temple. There's going to be a big feast that goes along with that as well. And so this quantity of peace offerings would have meant a great feast for the people. Now, can the altar hold the quantity of sacrifices that the people are offering? No, it cannot. And we've been over this before. The altar, the bronze altar that they had constructed for the temple was 900 square feet of surface space on the top of it. It was 20 cubits by 20 cubits, which is 30 feet by 30 feet. Put together 900 square feet of surface space for the top of the altar. That doesn't contain the sacrifices. They had to basically sacrifice the animals on the ground in the middle of a courtyard just to get it all to fit. And then it says in verse 65 and 66 that they celebrated a festival. Jen, do you have something? 900 square feet. That's a good question. About half the auditorium. Anybody know how big this auditorium actually is? I'd say. All right, Keith has something. So basically, a little larger than Keith's first house was the square footage of the altar. Think about that. How big was the apartment we first lived in, Jen? Yeah, I was probably smaller as well. It was, so there's it's a pretty big amount of offerings that they don't have enough room to fit it all on the altar. And I guess we'll use half the auditorium as a ballpark figure. Okay. All right. Well, he's the engineer with all the spatial knowledge, so I'll take his word for it. All right, but the other thing is going on. They're celebrating a festival here in verses 65 and 66. And do anybody remember what festival this was? It is the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles. We know that because of what it said all the way back at the beginning of chapter 8, where it says that it was in verse 2, the feast in the month Ethnaim, which is the 7th month. That was the time where they had there were three major things that happened in the 7th month of Israelite year. First day of the month, they had the Feast of Trumpets. 10th day of the month, they had the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Nobody was allowed to eat anything on Yom Kippur. That was the Day of Atonement. It was a day of fasting where they humbled their souls. But then there was a week-long feast called the Feast of Tabernacles. And what was the big thing they did during that feast? Anybody remember? Yes. They slept in tents. They went and they got palm branches, they built tents for themselves, and they slept in tents. Why did they do that?
Right. All of it.
Yeah, it was a way of remembering the time that they spent in the wilderness in tents.
About Jews today, take a spot in their house and then up a little bit of a platform, palm fronds and lay over it, and build a little thing that's like a sort of like a tent. That's where they'll stay.
Okay. Yeah. It's kind of interesting though. They're here, they're in tents during the Feast of Tabernacles, dwelling in temporary shelters. And what are they doing at this Feast of Tabernacles? What are they commemorating? What's special about this Feast of Tabernacles? The ark is not in a tent anymore. It's been moved into the permanent structure. It's been moved into the temple. So the ark has come to a resting place, and the people continue to dwell in tents while all that's going on. The other thing you'll note is that the feast actually goes for double the normal length in verse 65. Feast of Tabernacles normally went for 7 days plus an 8th day. But here it goes 7 days, and then another 7 days, and then the 8th day as well. They double the length of the feast because of the specialness of the occasion. And in verse 66 it says that they each went to their tents joyful and glad of heart for all the goodness that the Lord had shown to David his servant and to Israel his people. Each one in Israel goes to his tent at the end of this. So they go from their tents, sleeping in tents, to going to their tents. There's one thing we should remember. That expression that Israel went each to his tent comes back later in the text in chapter 12. Whenever Rehoboam is confronted with the people and he answers them harshly, the people say, "We no longer want to be part of this kingdom. We have no inheritance in Jesse." They say, "To your tents, O Israel. Look after your own house, David." So Israel departed to their tents. There it has more of a bad connotation. Israel flees to their tents as a way of dividing the kingdom. But in chapter 8, going to their tents is a good thing because they're joyful and glad of heart. Because the nation is unified by the presence of God among them. That changes later. All right. So any other questions or thoughts down through the end of chapter 8? Chapter 9, God's response. Can I get somebody to read the first 9 verses of chapter 9? Yes. Okay. Now, what do we think of this? God's response to Solomon. This is really kind of God didn't speak at all in chapter 8 whenever they moved all the stuff, his ark, into the temple. Chapter 9, the Lord speaks. All right. Yeah, would you say that this is a cheerful way to respond, or is it kind of more ominous? It's more ominous, isn't it? Yeah. Why? Jen? It's a place where there was... wait. No, it doesn't say he appeared to him at Gibeon here. It said he appeared to him as he had appeared at Gibeon in verse 2. And that's a reference back to chapter 3 in verse 5. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. That's where the Lord promises him, where Solomon asks for wisdom and the Lord gives him wisdom and promises him wealth and all those other things. Done. That's fine. If. The big if. That's... Yeah. Mark, you have something.
Who are the most unhappy all the time? People who get everything. People who have the most. Think they're oppressed and everybody's against them and all of this kind of stuff. God knows that when we get everything, sometimes it will disappoint us. I think that seems to be part of it, why he's cautioning Solomon here. He continues to caution him that he knows Solomon is getting a lot of blessings. Solomon is going to have a good life. And
right. Yeah. Solomon just gave that very lengthy prayer in chapter 8, and there's a lot of good stuff in that prayer. Does the Lord approve of that prayer? Did he listen to that prayer? Absolutely. It says right here he did, doesn't it? I have heard your prayer. I've heard your supplication. And guess what? Did God answer Solomon's prayer in the affirmative? He did. He said, I consecrated the house which you built for me. I put my name there forever. My eyes and heart will be there perpetually. Solomon's going to do what God's going to do what Solomon asked. He's going to be faithful to his promises. But, and here's the big but, it still requires the faithfulness of Solomon, of the people. That's the big if. If Solomon walks as David walked, then his kingdom will be established forever. But if Solomon or his descendants turn from God, well, God will take away their blessings. And in light of the fact that Solomon's prayer itself addressed a situation of exile, if is really more a matter of when, isn't it? Because it's coming. And if you cheated and you peeked ahead to the end of the story in 2 Kings, you know how the story ends. This house gets destroyed. The big if turns out to be more of a when. When Israel fails to walk in his ways. And what happens? Well, they become a proverb and a byword. Infidelity brings the loss of turf and temple and throne. They lose their land, they lose their sanctuary, and they lose their king. Israel will be kicked out of the land in verse 7, and the temple will be destroyed and become a heap of ruins. And implicitly, well, that forever promise of establishing Solomon on the throne and his house on the throne won't be forever. It'll be taken away. He does. And this isn't the first time in the text that he's reminded them either. You go back to chapter 6 and verses 11 through 13, there are some textual issues with that passage, but it's the same thing. God tells him, if you walk in my ways, then I will bless this house. Well, it's a big if. It's a conditional statement is what it is. God's favor is conditional, even when conditions aren't stated. When God gave the promise to David in 2 Samuel 7, are there any conditions explicitly stated in that passage? No. But doesn't mean they're not there. All prophecies in the Bible contain some degree of contingency to them. It's like when Jonah goes to Nineveh, and he goes through the city, and all he says that we have recorded is 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. No condition stated there. Was Nineveh overthrown in 40 days? No, it wasn't. because the people repented and the Lord changed his mind. So even though a condition was not stated, it was implicitly there. That's the way all prophecies in the Bible are. The Lord will change his mind in response to human repentance. If mankind suddenly gets it into his head that, you know what? Maybe I should be following the Lord. Well, then the Lord will grant favor to that person. And that person will ultimately live. There's a certain irony in the fact that Solomon and his people become a proverb and a byword. Anybody catch that? What was Solomon famous for? His wisdom. Speaking proverbs. The man who speaks proverbs will become a proverb if he is not careful. Don't be like Solomon. Everyone who passes by that city is going to look at it and they're going to know why it was destroyed. And those people, they forsook Yahweh. They served other gods. And, well, they got what was coming to them. Don't be like Israel. Don't be like Solomon. Here's a lesson there. Don't live your life in such a way that people use you as a bad example in sermons. Think about it. Do not live your life in such a way that you become a bad example in a sermon. It's not a good thing. You know, it's something to think about. And I think that's a lesson that Solomon's being taught here, isn't it? You know, if you're not careful, if you don't walk in my ways, you will become a proverb and a byword. Okay. Any comments or questions down to verse 9? Verse 10. And now we're going to get more into really what is kind of kind of like what we saw in chapters 3, 4, and 5. This section feels a little hodgepodgey. There's a lot of economic statements and other things about Solomon's wealth and his dealings with other peoples. So his building projects. And there are other ancient versions of this text that contain all the same material, but put it all in a different order, which makes it hard to kind of figure out what the structure is. But let's just go ahead and start reading through this. Verses 10 through 14. It came about at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house. Hiram, king of Tyre, had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress and timber and gold according to all his desire. Then Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. So Hiram came up from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, and they did not please him. He said, "Well, what are these cities which you have given me, my brother?" So they are called the land of Kabul to this day. And Hiram sent to the king 120 talents of gold. All right, so Solomon, payment to Hiram. How do we understand? What do we think about this? The way that Solomon pays Hiram with these cities. Don. Okay, so Hiram didn't give very good cities, did he? You think about that. That's what does Hiram call these cities? He calls them Kabul. Anybody know what that means? Good as nothing. Kabul, there's actually two suggestions. One I think is more likely is as good as nothing or like nothing. The other suggestion that's sometimes thrown out is the cognate with an Akkadian term which means fettered, which basically, the idea is you've chained me down by giving me these useless cities. Either way, it's not a happy expression. Jen, they're not like what? Oh yeah, I know, exactly. Can anything good come out of Galilee? Yeah, that's a good point to bring out. John chapter 1, Nathanael makes that comment, can anything good come out of Galilee? Well, back then they said the same thing. Hiram looks at the cities and goes, these cities are no good. Of course, is this intended to be complimentary to Solomon? Did Solomon do right or wrong here? This is one of those instances where the Bible doesn't really give you the divine commentary on the exchange. And so sometimes, of course, men like to speculate a little bit about what goes on. One guy I read, for instance, sees it as an indication that Solomon's run up too much debt, so he has to cede cities, Israelite cities, over. Some people think that this is a completely different economic deal that has nothing to do with the temple and has to do more with the gold import from Ophir instead, which we see later in this chapter. I don't know. I don't have an answer on that. But it is interesting, the point that Don makes, Solomon definitely comes off as the winner economically in this exchange anyway. But it doesn't seem like his great shining moment either, a good way to repay your allies. Now Hiram still works with him. Hiram gives him 120 talents of gold. That's a lot of money. That's over 4 tons. I didn't look up what that would go for in today's dollars, but it goes for a lot. Done. Right. Okay, yeah. Yeah. It's hard to, sort out some of what's going on here between them. Yeah. Hiram and David were good friends. Hiram built a house for David. Hiram basically helped supplied the materials for these houses in exchange for, food and eventually cities. But the cities wind up being like nothing. They wind up being Kabul. He did call him that, that's true. He called him my brother. It's I guess a term of endearment or affection. Not that they're biologically related, but yeah. What are these cities you have given me, my brother? Sarcastic. I like that. You know how that works? All things being equal, the interpretation of the Bible that is most sarcastic will be preferred. No, that's a humorous response. But we are out of time. We will pick up with verse 15. Sorry. We start with verse 15 next time in chapter 9. And hopefully get through chapter 10 on Thursday night. We'll see how that works out. Thank you all for your comments. Good discussion today.